The coffee was cold by the time it hit Garrett Sullivan's chest, but the humiliation burned hot enough to sear through 2 years of carefully constructed invisibility. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood there with the industrial mop in his hands while the brown liquid soaked through his gray maintenance uniform and dripped onto the marble floor he'd spent the last hour polishing to a mirror shine. Victoria Crane didn't bother looking up from her phone. Her manicured fingers kept scrolling, dismissing him with the same casual contempt she'd shown every morning for 23 months. "You missed a spot, and get someone to clean this up. I need another coffee." The words hung in the air like stale cigarette smoke. Garrett watched the back of her head, the perfectly styled blonde hair that cost more than his monthly rent, the designer suit that screamed power and privilege. 2 years, 730 days of being nobody. 730 days of choosing this exact life, this exact humiliation, because the alternative was worse. "Yes, ma'am." His voice came out flat, mechanical, the voice of a man who'd learned to swallow his pride so many times the reflex had become automatic. He bent down, started mopping again. The same floor, the same stain, the same suffocating silence that followed him like a shadow through every corridor of sterling private aviation. The facility occupied the top 3 floors of Chicago's most exclusive airport complex, a glass and steel monument to wealth that catered to people who considered commercial first class an insult. Private jets for billionaires, charter flights for celebrities who couldn't be bothered with TSA lines, a rooftop runway that cost more than most neighborhoods combined. Garrett knew every inch of it. Every corner where executives made deals worth millions while he emptied their trash cans 3 feet away. Every bathroom where pilots he'd once outranked took showers after transcontinental flights. Every window that overlooked the tarmac where aircraft worth more than small countries sat gleaming in the morning sun. Nobody saw him. That was the agreement he'd made with himself the day he took this job. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. Cash the check. Go home to Cole. His son was the only thing that mattered now. The only thing that had mattered since Sarah's funeral 3 years ago, when he'd stood beside a too small casket holding a 5-year-old boy who kept asking when Mommy was coming back. The only thing that mattered since the night he'd burned his flight suit in the backyard and sworn he'd never touch a cockpit again. Again. Marcus Webb's voice cut through his thoughts like a dull blade. The maintenance supervisor stood in the doorway of the supply closet, arms crossed over a chest that had gone soft with age but still carried the weight of 40 years working around aircraft. 62 years old, hands like leather from decades of turning wrenches and handling fuel lines, eyes that had seen everything aviation had to offer and most of what it could take away. Garrett looked up from the stained shirt he was changing into a fresh uniform. "It's fine, Marcus. That's the 3rd time this month Victoria's accidentally spilled coffee on you." The word accidentally landed with deliberate sarcasm, starting to look less like an accident and more like a pattern. "I said it's fine," but Marcus didn't move from the doorway. He just stood there studying Garrett with the same intensity he'd shown every day for the past 2 years, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense. "You know something, Rook? I've worked around pilots my whole life. 40 years in this business. I know what they look like, how they move, how they carry themselves." Garrett's hands stopped on the buttons of his fresh shirt. Nobody had called him Rook in 8 years. Nobody had used his old call sign since the day he'd walked out of Edwards Air Force Base with a duffel bag full of medals he'd never wear and a head full of screams he couldn't silence. "You walk like a pilot. You look at aircraft like a pilot. Hell, I've seen you watching takeoffs like a man watching his first love drive away for the last time. I'm a janitor." "No." Marcus pushed off the doorframe. "You're a janitor now, but that's not what you are." The distinction hit harder than it should have. Garrett finished buttoning his shirt, picked up his mop, tried to move past Marcus without meeting his eyes. "My shift ends at 6. Cole's waiting." But Marcus's hand caught his arm, firm but not aggressive. Just enough pressure to make him stop. Just enough weight to make him listen. "I found something last week. Fell out of your locker when you forgot to close it all the way. The blood drained from Garrett's face. He knew what Marcus had found. Knew it with the same certainty he knew his own heartbeat. The Air Force ID he'd thought he'd thrown away but couldn't quite bring himself to destroy. The one piece of evidence that proved he'd once been someone other than the invisible man mopping floors in a building full of people who'd never know his name. You want to tell me why a former test pilot with 11 years at Edwards is cleaning toilets in my hangar? Garrett pulled his arm free, kept his voice level, kept his face blank. That was a different life. A long time ago. 8 years isn't that long. Marcus's voice softened, shifted from confrontation to something that felt almost like concern. Whatever you're running from, son, it's gonna catch up with you eventually. That's how these things work. You can't hide forever. But Garrett was already walking away, mop in hand, uniform damp at the collar where coffee had soaked through. He didn't have an answer for Marcus. Didn't have an answer for anyone. The truth was buried too deep, wrapped in too many layers of guilt and grief and a specific kind of exhaustion that came from waking up every morning at 3 a.m. to the sound of alarms that only existed in his memory. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms in Rogers Park, the kind of neighborhood where working people lived paycheck to paycheck, and nobody asked too many questions about your past. Thin walls that let through every argument from the couple next door. A kitchen that barely fit 2 people standing. A bathroom with tiles that had been installed sometime during the Carter administration, and fixtures that groaned every time you turned on the water. But it was home. The only home Cole had known since Sarah died. Mrs. Brennan was dozing on the couch when Garrett walked in, her knitting needles still in her hands, half-finished scarf pooled in her lap. 67 years old, widowed for a decade, with a Boston accent that 40 years in Chicago hadn't quite erased. She'd been their neighbor since Cole was born, the grandmother figure who'd stepped in when Sarah died and Garrett had been too broken to function. Her eyes opened at the sound of the door. "You're home, dear." She set down her needles, stood with the careful movements of someone whose knees didn't work quite like they used to. "Cole's asleep. Been asking for you all evening. I'm sorry it ran late. Don't you apologize to me, Garrett Sullivan." Mrs. Brennan gathered her things, touched his arm with the kind of gentle firmness that reminded him of his own mother. "You're doing the best you can. That boy knows you love him. That's what matters." After she left, Garrett stood in the doorway of Cole's room, watching his son sleep. 8 years old now. Growing too fast, changing too quickly. Turning into a person Garrett sometimes struggled to recognize. The stuffed elephant Sarah had bought him before she died was tucked under his arm. His face was peaceful in sleep, unmarked by the questions that had started creeping into their conversations over the past few months. Questions Garrett didn't know how to answer. "Dad?" The word came soft, sleepy, barely more than a whisper. Garrett stepped into the room, sat on the edge of the narrow bed. "Hey, buddy. I didn't mean to wake you." Cole's eyes were open now, Sarah's eyes, the same shade of brown that had made Garrett fall in love the first time he'd seen her across a crowded college party. "We learned about airplanes today at school." "Yeah?" Mrs. Patterson showed us pictures. Big ones. She said pilots are heroes. Cole's face grew serious, the way it did when he was working through something important. "Were you ever a pilot, Dad?" The question landed like a punch to the solar plexus. Garrett's throat closed around words that wouldn't come. "Where would you ask that?" "Because you always look at the sky." Cole shifted, pulling the elephant closer. "Mom used to say things before she—" His voice trailed off, the sentence unfinished, because finishing it meant acknowledging something an 8-year-old shouldn't have to understand. "What did Mom say?" "She said you used to fly before I was born, before everything got sad." The words hung between them in the dim light of the bedroom, heavy with implications Garrett had spent 3 years trying to avoid. He looked at his son. This small person who carried half of Sarah's DNA and all of her intuition, who somehow knew things he shouldn't know, and asked questions that cut straight through every defense Garrett had built. That was a different life, buddy. A long time ago. But you could fly again, right? If you wanted to? Some doors close for good reasons, Cole. The boy's face fell, disappointment mixing with something else, something that looked uncomfortably like shame. His classmates' fathers had jobs they could brag about. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, people who wore suits and went to offices and did things that made sense when you were 8 years old and trying to figure out where you fit in the world. Not janitors. Not invisible men who came home smelling like industrial cleaner and avoided conversations about what they used to be. Come on. Garrett stood, ruffled Cole's hair. Let's make spaghetti. Your favorite. The boy's face lit up, the questions forgotten for now, replaced by the simple joy of knowing his father was home and dinner was coming. But as Garrett stood at the stove 20 minutes later, stirring sauce that came from a jar because he'd never learned to cook the way Sarah had, his hands gripped the wooden spoon like it was a control stick. In his mind, he was climbing. Always climbing. Into clouds he would never touch again. The nightmare came at 3 a.m. It always came at 3 a.m., as predictable as sunrise, as inevitable as breathing. Lieutenant Jason Rodriguez's face filled his vision. 25 years old. Eager. Talented. Reminded Garrett of himself at that age, back when flying felt like the only thing that made sense in a world that rarely did. What do we do, Captain? What do we do? The alarm screaming, the aircraft spinning, the ground rushing up like a fist intent on crushing them both. Garrett's hands moving through procedures that should have worked, responses that should have saved them, training that should have been enough. It wasn't enough. Pull up, pull up, pull up. Garrett sat bolt upright in bed, sweat soaking through his shirt, heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. He looked at the clock. 3:17 a.m., same as always. 2 hours and 43 minutes until his shift started. 2 hours and 43 minutes to sit in the dark and remember what it felt like to fail someone who'd trusted him with their life. He didn't go back to sleep. He never went back to sleep. The call came at 6:15, just as Garrett was finishing the morning sweep of the executive corridor. Kate Sterling burst through the main doors like a hurricane given human form. 43 years old, navy suit that probably cost more than Garrett's annual salary, phone pressed to her ear, 2 assistants scrambling in her wake. He'd seen her before, of course. Seen her striding through the building with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money or security or whether you could make rent next month. Seen her in board meetings through conference room windows, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives with the casual authority of someone who'd been born into power and never questioned her right to wield it. But he'd never seen her like this. Never seen the cracks in the armor. Never seen fear. What do you mean, unconscious? Her voice carried across the marble lobby. When did surgery start? How bad? Garrett kept mopping, tried to stay invisible, but the chaos was unavoidable. Victoria appeared, tablet in hand, already making calls. 2 more assistants materialized from offices, everyone moving with the frantic energy of an emergency they hadn't planned for. Get me a pilot. Kate ended her call, threw the phone at Victoria with barely controlled violence. Now! I need to be in Miami in 90 minutes. Garrett's hand stilled on the mop handle. Miami. 90 minutes. His mind automatically calculated the flight time, the aircraft they'd need, the procedures for emergency medical transport. No, he forced himself back to mopping. Not his problem. Not his life anymore. Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek as she cycled through call after call. Captain Reynolds is in Seattle. Henderson's in New York. Martinez is on medical leave. I don't want excuses. Kate's composure was cracking, the Ice Queen facade melting under pressure. I want a pilot. My mother is dying. The words cut through the chaos like a blade. Garrett looked up despite himself, saw Kate Sterling's face for the first time as something other than an executive's mask. Saw the daughter underneath, the scared child facing something money and power couldn't fix. "Ma'am, there's a Category 2 hurricane approaching Florida." Victoria's face was pale. "Most pilots are refusing the flight. The weather, my mother is in surgery right now." Kate's voice broke. "If I don't get there." She turned away, pressed her hand against her mouth, the gesture so raw and human it felt obscene to witness. Garrett looked away, gave her privacy for grief she hadn't asked to display in public. Victoria made call after call, each one ending the same way. "Unavailable. Booked. Can't fly into Miami today. Sorry, the weather's too dangerous." The silence that followed felt final, terminal, the kind of silence that preceded surrender. Garrett should have kept mopping, should have stayed invisible, should have remembered the promise he'd made 8 years ago, the vow he'd sworn over Jason Rodriguez's grave. But his mouth opened before his brain could stop it. "I can fly it." 3 words, 12 letters, a grenade with the pin pulled. The entire lobby went silent. Victoria turned first, her face twisted with something between disbelief and rage. "Excuse me?" Garrett set down the mop, stepped forward into the space where executives made decisions and maintenance staff were supposed to remain unseen. "I can fly it. The Gulfstream G650 in Bay 3. I can get you to Miami." Victoria's laugh was sharp, ugly, designed to wound. "The janitor. The janitor wants to fly a $65 million aircraft." Rachel, the younger assistant, covered her mouth, shoulders shaking with barely suppressed laughter. Even the security guard at the door cracked a smile. But Kate Sterling didn't laugh. She walked toward Garrett slowly, heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, taking in the gray uniform, the worn work boots, the calloused hands of a man who scrubbed toilets for a living. "What's your name?" "Garrett Sullivan." She repeated it slowly, testing the weight of it. "Garrett Sullivan. And where exactly did you learn to fly a Gulfstream, Mr. Sullivan?" Garrett met her eyes, held them, let her see something he hadn't shown anyone in 8 years. Air Force Test Pilot Division, Edwards Air Force Base. 11 years. The laughter stopped. Victoria's smile froze. Rachel straightened up. The entire hangar went silent. Kate's eyes narrowed, searching his face for the lie, for the joke, for any sign this was some elaborate delusion. "Test pilot." "Yes, ma'am. You're telling me a former Air Force test pilot is mopping floors in my hangar?" "Yes, ma'am. Why?" Garrett didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The truth was too heavy, too soaked in blood and fire and the sound of metal tearing itself apart. The truth was Jason Rodriguez's face asking questions Garrett still couldn't answer. Kate studied him for another long moment. Then she stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, expensive and sharp, like everything about her. "Let me make you an offer, Mr. Sullivan." She paused, let the silence build. "Fly this jet to Miami. Land it without a scratch." Her mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "And I'll give you anything you want." The lobby erupted. Victoria's laughter bordered on hysterical. Rachel doubled over. The assistants exchanged glances that said they'd found their gossip for the next month. The janitor and the CEO. The maintenance man shooting his shot. The invisible man who thought he could be seen. Garrett stood perfectly still while humiliation burned through his chest. This was the cost of breaking invisibility. This was what happened when you forgot your place, when you reached for something beyond the safety of shadows. Kate's smile widened. Cold, triumphant. "Well, Mr. Sullivan?" She said his name like it was the punchline to a joke only she understood. "What do you say?" Garrett felt something shift inside him. Something he'd buried 8 years ago. Something he'd locked away after the crash, after the funeral, after the second funeral. Jason Rodriguez's voice echoed in his mind, the same question on an endless loop. What do we do, Captain? And for the first time in 8 years, Garrett had an answer. I say we stop wasting time. He met Kate Sterling's eyes, held them without flinching. Your mother's waiting. The laughter died. Garrett turned and walked toward Bay 3. Behind him, Victoria's voice rose to a shriek. Security! Someone stop him! He's delusional! But Marcus Webb stepped in front of the security guard, blocked his path with the solid presence of a man who'd earned his authority through decades of competence. Let him go. Marcus, he's a janitor. I know exactly what he is. Marcus's voice was steady, certain, carrying the weight of those 40 years in aviation. And I'm telling you, let him go. Kate Sterling watched the exchange, her face unreadable. Then she made a decision. Get my bag. Victoria's jaw dropped. What? My overnight bag. Kate's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Get it now. Ma'am, you can't seriously. That's an order. Kate walked toward Bay 3 following Garrett, her heels clicking against concrete in a rhythm that felt like inevitability. The Gulfstream G650 sat waiting in the hangar, white and silver, $65 million of precision engineering gleaming under the industrial lights. Garrett climbed the stairs, his legs feeling strange, heavy, like walking through water. 8 years. 8 years since he'd touched a cockpit. 8 years since Jason. He pushed the thought away, forced himself forward. The cockpit door was open. The seats waited, leather and pristine, exactly like 1,000 cockpits he'd sat in before. Garrett lowered himself into the pilot's chair. His hands trembled. Then muscle memory took over, pushing past fear and doubt and guilt. His fingers found the master switch, the battery, the fuel pumps. Each movement precise, automatic, like riding a bicycle, like breathing. The instruments came alive. Lights blinked on. Gauges stabilized. The aircraft hummed with potential energy, waiting for someone to unlock what it could do. Garrett heard footsteps behind him. Kate Sterling appeared in the cockpit doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope or might have been terror. You actually know what you're doing. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. She moved to the passenger cabin, sat down, the seatbelt clicking home with mechanical finality. If you crash my jet, I'll sue you for 3 lifetimes. Understood. Garrett reached for the radio. His voice came out different, transformed, formal and professional in a way that had nothing to do with mopping floors and everything to do with the man he used to be. Sterling Tower, this is November 7-7 Sierra requesting immediate departure clearance. Destination Miami International. Priority medical. Silence on the radio. Then, November 7-7 Sierra. Say again. Pilot identification. Garrett paused. For 8 years, he'd been nobody, a ghost, a shadow mopping floors in a building full of people who never saw him. But not today. Captain Garrett Sullivan. Air Force retired. ATP certification number, Alpha Tango 7732. Another pause, longer this time. Garrett waited, his hands resting on the throttle. Behind him, Kate Sterling watched through the cockpit door. He could feel her eyes on his back, feel the weight of her judgment, her hope, her desperation. The radio crackled. November 7. 7. Sierra, you are cleared for immediate departure. Runway 27. Wind bearing 090 at 15 knots. Be advised, Miami is reporting deteriorating conditions. Recommend extreme caution. Roger Tower. Sierra rolling. Garrett pushed the throttle forward. The engines roared to life, the sound filling the cockpit, filling his chest, filling 8 years of silence with something that felt almost like coming home. The jet began to move. Victoria stood on the tarmac, phone in hand, mouth open in an expression that would have been funny if Garrett had any capacity left for humor. Marcus Webb watched from the hangar door, arms crossed, a small smile on his weathered face that said, "I knew it." The jet accelerated. Faster. Faster. Chicago blurred past the windows. Garrett pulled back on the yoke. The wheels left the ground. And for the first time in 8 years, Garrett Sullivan was flying. Chicago fell away beneath them. The lake stretched out silver and vast, morning sun turning its surface into hammered metal. The buildings shrank to toys. The highways became ribbons of light threading through a landscape that looked almost peaceful from 15,000 feet. Garrett leveled off at 12,000, set the heading for Miami, checked the instruments. Everything was perfect. His hands weren't shaking anymore. His breathing was steady. His mind was clear. This was where he belonged. He'd forgotten. Or maybe he'd forced himself to forget. Captain Sullivan. Kate Sterling's voice came from behind him. She'd unbuckled, moved to the cockpit doorway despite his earlier warning about turbulence. "You should stay seated, ma'am. We might hit rough air. I've flown 100 times. I'll risk it." She stepped into the cockpit, stood beside the co-pilot seat, but didn't sit. Her presence filled the small space, bringing with it the scent of expensive perfume and the weight of questions Garrett didn't want to answer. "How long were you in the Air Force?" 11 years. "Test pilot the whole time?" "Last 7 years. Before that, combat missions. 2 tours overseas, Iraq, Afghanistan, other places that don't make the news." Kate was quiet, processing, reassessing everything she thought she knew about the man who'd been invisible for 2 years. "Why did you stop?" The question cut deep, deeper than she could know. Garrett's jaw tightened. "Things change. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." Kate was silent for another moment. Then she sat in the co-pilot seat carefully, like she was handling something fragile. "My father was a pilot." Garrett glanced at her, first time really looking. "Captain James Sterling, United Airlines, 35 years. Maybe you've heard of him." "I have. He's a legend in aviation circles. He built Sterling Aviation when he retired. Handed it to me 4 years ago." She paused. "We haven't spoken since." "Why not?" "Because I changed things, modernized, made decisions he didn't agree with." Kate's voice hardened. "He called me ungrateful, said I was destroying his legacy." "Were you?" Kate turned to him, surprised by the directness. "No. I was saving it." Garrett nodded, said nothing. Outside the window, clouds built on the horizon, gray and thick, pregnant with the storm they were flying toward. He checked the weather reports. Miami was still open, barely. They'd have a window, maybe 30 minutes. The approach wouldn't be smooth. "Can you do it?" "Yes." Kate accepted this without question. Something had changed in how she looked at him. The invisible man had become visible, had become real, had become someone worth listening to. "Tell me something, Captain Sullivan." "What?" "The truth. Why is a man with your skills cleaning toilets in my hangar?" Garrett's hands tightened on the yoke. The memory came without warning, sharp and immediate. Jason Rodriguez's face, young and terrified. "What do we do, Captain?" The alarm screaming, the aircraft spinning, the ground rushing up like death itself. "Captain!" Garrett blinked. The cockpit snapped back into focus. "I lost someone." The words came out rough, scraped from somewhere deep. "A co-pilot. Lieutenant Jason Rodriguez, 25 years old, first deployment in my unit. Eager, talented, reminded me of myself at that age." Kate didn't speak, just listened. "We were testing a new flight system. High altitude, experimental. Something went wrong with the controls." Garrett's voice flattened, mechanical, the only way he could tell it. The aircraft entered an uncontrolled spin. "I tried everything, every recovery technique, every procedure. Nothing worked. We were falling at 6,000 feet per minute." "What happened?" "I got us down somehow. Emergency landing in a field outside Palmdale. The aircraft was destroyed. And Lieutenant Rodriguez?" Ryan was silent for a long moment. "He didn't survive the impact. The cockpit felt smaller, the air thinner. Outside, the storm built on the horizon, waiting. Kate's voice came soft. The investigation cleared you. Equipment failure. Nothing I could have done. They offered me my command back. Promotion, commendations, everything. But you didn't take it. How could I? Garrett's voice cracked, first time showing real emotion. Every time I looked at a cockpit, I saw his face. Every time I touched the controls, I heard him asking me what to do. Like I had the answer. Like I could save him. He shook his head. I couldn't fly anymore. So I stopped. Kate processed this, her face softening in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable, more human. And your wife? The assistants mentioned you're a single father. The familiar knife twisted in Garrett's chest. Sarah. Just her name hurt. We met in college. She was a teacher, 2nd grade. Loved kids more than anything. What happened to her? 3 years ago, driving home from work. Rainy night. Drunk driver crossed the median. I'm sorry. Yeah. Garrett stared at the horizon, at the storm building in their path. Me too. So, you lost your co-pilot, then your wife, and then I had a son to raise alone on a janitor's salary because I couldn't get back in the air. Kate leaned back in the seat, let out a long breath. And I made a joke about giving you anything you want. Her voice was tight with something that might have been shame. That was cruel. I'm sorry. Garrett looked at her, really looked. For the first time, he saw past the CEO, past the cold exterior, past the woman who'd humiliated him in front of everyone. He saw a daughter rushing to her dying mother. A woman estranged from her father, someone carrying her own weight, her own grief, her own loneliness. Apology accepted. The radio crackled. November 7 Sierra, Miami. Approach control. Be advised weather deteriorating rapidly. Recommend immediate approach. Garrett keyed the mic. Roger, Miami. Sierra beginning descent. Request vectors for runway 9er right. Sierra, turn right heading 140. Descend and maintain 3000. Expect ILS approach runway 9er right. Right 140 down to 3000. Sierra. Garrett began the descent. The clouds rose to meet them, gray walls building toward something that looked less like weather and more like a physical barrier designed to keep them out. Kate returned to the passenger cabin without being told, buckled in, her face set in an expression that tried for confidence but couldn't quite hide fear. The aircraft entered the cloud layer. The world went gray. Visibility dropped to 0. Rain hammered the windscreen like gravel thrown by an angry god. The turbulence hit hard, immediate, violent. The Gulf Stream shuddered, warning lights flickering, the frame groaning under stress. Garrett's hands moved constantly, making corrections, adjustments, fighting the wind that wanted to push them off course. Sierra, you're drifting left, of course. Turn right heading 150. Right 150. The aircraft bucked, dropped 50 feet in a second. Kate gasped from the cabin. Garrett's voice came calm, steady. It's okay. Just wind shear. I've got it. But the storm was worse than predicted. Much worse. The wind gusted to 42 knots crosswind, well above the aircraft's certified limits. Visibility stayed at 0. The instruments became everything. Garrett flew by numbers, by feel, by instinct, honed over 1,000 flights in conditions that ranged from merely dangerous to actively suicidal. The altitude unwound. 3,000, 2,000, 1,500. Sierra, you're below glide path. Pull up. Garrett pulled back. The engine screamed. The aircraft climbed slightly, fighting for every foot. Sierra, cleared to land runway 9er right. Wind gusting to 42 knots. Surface winds variable. Sierra cleared to land. 500 feet. The rain was a solid wall of water. 400 feet. The aircraft shuddered, bucked left. Garrett corrected with rudder and aileron, fighting forces that wanted to tear control from his hands. 300 feet. 200 feet. The runway lights appeared through the rain, ghostly and wavering like spirits guiding him home. 100 feet. Garrett crabbed into the wind, held the heading, every muscle tensed. 50 feet. He kicked the rudder, aligned with the center line. 20 feet. The main gear touched, hard but controlled, the impact jarring through the frame. The aircraft bounced once. Garrett held it, brought the nose down, reverse thrust, brakes. The Gulf Stream slowed, slower, and stopped. They were down. Garrett taxied to the gate, shut down the engines, ran through the post-flight checklist with hands that moved on autopilot. For a moment, he just sat there, forehead pressed against the cool metal of the yoke, heart pounding, breath coming fast. He'd done it. Against every odd, against every fear, against 8 years of running from who he used to be. Kate appeared in the doorway. Her face was wet, though whether from rain or tears, Garrett couldn't tell. That wasn't a landing. Her voice shook. That was a miracle. Garrett unbuckled, stood on legs that felt like rubber. It was physics. That's all. No. Kate stepped closer. That was something else. I've flown with dozens of pilots, elite ones, the best in the business. She paused. None of them could have done what you just did. Garrett didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to accept praise for something that felt less like skill and more like desperation. He moved toward the exit, but Kate's voice stopped him. Come with me. Where? To the hospital. I should stay with the aircraft. Please. The word surprised, both of them. Kate Sterling didn't beg, didn't ask, didn't show weakness. But here she was, standing in the doorway of a jet that shouldn't have been able to land, asking a janitor she'd mocked 6 hours ago to help her face something she couldn't face alone. My mother's in surgery. My father will be there, and I... She stopped, took a breath. I don't want to face them alone. Garrett looked at this woman who'd humiliated him, who'd made him a punchline, who'd treated him like he was less than nothing. He thought about Cole, about Sarah, about all the times he'd faced darkness alone because there was nobody left to stand beside him. Let me secure the aircraft. Kate nodded, wiped her eyes, walked to the exit. Garrett began the shutdown checklist, his hands moving automatically through procedures ingrained by years of training. But his mind was somewhere else. On Jason. On Sarah. On Cole waiting at home with Mrs. Brennan. On the door that had just cracked open after 8 years of being sealed shut. The hospital corridor smelled like bleach and desperation. Garrett walked beside Kate, still wearing the maintenance uniform that marked him as someone who didn't belong in places where life and death decisions happened behind closed doors. People stared, whispered. A man in work clothes next to a woman in a designer suit. They made no sense together, a puzzle with pieces from different boxes forced into uncomfortable proximity. Kate didn't seem to notice. Her eyes fixed straight ahead, her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides in a rhythm that spoke of barely controlled panic. She's in recovery. That's what they told me on the phone. Recovery. But they wouldn't say more. That's usually a good sign. Is it? If it wasn't, they would have said more. They always do. Kate glanced at him, something flickering in her eyes that might have been gratitude, or might just have been exhaustion. They reached the cardiac unit. A nurse looked up from her station, her face professionally neutral. Mrs. Margaret Sterling, room 412. Family only. He's with me. Kate's voice left no room for argument, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to having orders followed without question. The nurse nodded, pointed down the hall. Room 412 was at the end, the door half open, voices drifting out. Kate stopped so abruptly Garrett nearly walked into her. Her whole body went rigid, muscles locking up like someone had hit a switch. What's wrong? My father. Her voice was barely a whisper. I can hear him. Garrett listened. A man's voice, deep and commanding, talking to someone about medications and procedures. The tone was familiar, the cadence of someone who'd spent decades giving orders and having them obeyed. You haven't seen him in 4 years, no. He's probably scared too. Kate turned to him, her eyes wet. You don't know my father. James Sterling doesn't get scared. He gets angry. Same thing sometimes. She stared at him for a long moment, processing something. Then she pushed open the door. The room was small, white walls and monitors beeping in mechanical harmony. Margaret Sterling lay in the bed, pale but breathing, tubes connecting her to machines that tracked every heartbeat. Standing beside her, back to the door, was a tall man with silver hair and shoulders like a linebacker gone slightly soft with age. He turned at the sound. James Sterling had his daughter's eyes, blue and sharp as broken glass, the kind of eyes that assessed and categorized and made judgments in the time it took most people to blink. Kate. Dad. The word hung between them, heavy with 4 years of silence, 4 years of hurt, 4 years of words that couldn't be taken back no matter how much either of them might wish otherwise. James's gaze shifted to Garrett, scanned him head to toe, taking in the uniform, the work boots, the calloused hands. "Who the hell is this?" "This is Captain Garrett Sullivan." Kate's voice was steady now, finding strength in formality. "He flew me here." "Captain," James's eyebrows rose, the skepticism clear. "In that outfit? It's a long story. I'm sure it is." James turned back to his wife, dismissed Garrett like he was furniture, something to be noted and then ignored. Kate moved to her mother's bedside, took her hand with a gentleness that didn't match the steel in her spine. "How is she?" "Surgery went well. 4 bypasses. She'll need months of recovery." James's voice was clipped, medical, but underneath the professional tone lurked something raw. "But she'll live, thank God." God had nothing to do with it. The surgeon did. Kate closed her eyes, fighting for control, fighting not to break. "I'm glad she's okay, Dad." "Are you?" James turned to face her, his voice rising. "Is that why you haven't visited in 4 years? Why you missed her birthday 3 times? Why she cries every time your name comes up? Dad, please." "No." James stepped toward her, closing the distance. "You don't get to walk in here and pretend everything's fine. You abandoned this family for your career, for that company, for—" "I didn't abandon anyone." Kate's voice rose to match his. "You pushed me away. I told you the truth. I told you that you were destroying everything I built. I was saving it. The company was hemorrhaging money. The fleet was outdated. If I hadn't—" "Enough." The word came from the bed, weak and raspy but firm enough to cut through the argument like a blade through fog. Margaret Sterling's eyes were open. She looked between her husband and daughter, her face carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent too many years watching people she loved tear each other apart. "Both of you. Stop." Kate dropped to her knees beside the bed, her composure finally shattering. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have—" "Hush." Margaret's hand found her daughter's cheek. "You're here now. That's what matters." James stood rigid, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides like he was physically restraining himself from continuing the fight. Margaret looked at him, her eyes carrying the weight of decades of marriage, of knowing someone well enough to see past their armor. "William, sit down. I'm fine standing. I almost died. Sit down." Something broke in James's face, just for a second. A crack in the armor he'd worn so long it had become part of his skin. He pulled a chair beside the bed, sat heavily like a man who'd been carrying too much weight for too long, and had finally found a place to set it down. Margaret looked at Garrett, still standing by the door, still invisible, except he wasn't invisible anymore, and that fact seemed to confuse everyone, including himself. "And who is this young man?" "Captain Sullivan." Kate's voice was stronger now, grounded by her mother's presence. "He flew me through a hurricane to get here." Margaret's eyebrows rose despite her exhaustion. "Through a hurricane?" The weather was deteriorating. Garrett kept his voice neutral. "We had a window. I took it." "He landed in 42-knot crosswinds," Kate added, her tone carrying something like awe. "In 0 visibility. It was the most incredible thing I've ever seen." James's head turned, his eyes narrowing, the dismissal gone and replaced by something else. "What aircraft?" "Gulfstream G650. Crosswind limit on a G650 is 38 knots. I know. You exceeded it by 4 knots. James leaned forward slightly. That's either brilliant or suicidal. Garrett met his gaze, held it without flinching. Depends on the pilot. The silence stretched, pregnant with assessment. James studied him with new interest, the way a master craftsman might examine another's work, looking for flaws and finding fewer than expected. Where did you train? Edwards Air Force Base, Test Pilot School, class of 2010. James's expression shifted, something moving behind his eyes. Edwards. I lectured there. Guest instructor 2007 and 2008. Advanced Instrument Procedures. I know, sir. I read your book, Flying the Edge, required reading for the program. For the first time, James almost smiled. The expression transformed his face, made him look younger, more human, less like a monument to aviation history, and more like someone who'd once been young and uncertain and learning just like everyone else. And what did you think of it? Read it 3 times. The chapter on crosswind techniques saved my life more than once. James leaned back in his chair, his whole demeanor changed. The anger was still there, buried deep, but overlaid now with something that looked like respect. And now, you're flying my daughter around in a janitor's uniform. It's complicated. I imagine it is. James's voice carried a weight that suggested he understood complicated in ways most people never would. Margaret cleared her throat, the sound small but effective. William, leave the poor man alone. She looked at Garrett with eyes that had seen decades of pilots and their particular brand of damage. Thank you for bringing my daughter home. It's been too long. Garrett nodded. You should rest, ma'am. I intend to. Her eyes moved to Kate. But first, I want you two to talk. Really talk. Not about the company, not about the past. Just talk. Mom, for me, please. Kate looked at James. He looked at her. 4 years of silence sat between them like a physical barrier, a wall built from pride and hurt, and the particular kind of damage that comes from loving someone and not knowing how to show it without causing pain. I'll be in the waiting room. Garrett moved toward the door before anyone could respond. He left the Sterling family to their reunion, their reconciliation, whatever this moment would become. The waiting room was empty except for a television playing news nobody was watching. Garrett sat in a plastic chair designed to be uncomfortable enough to discourage long stays, stretched his legs, let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His phone buzzed. Text from Mrs. Brennan. Cole asking when you'll be home. Everything okay? Garrett typed back. Flight ran long. Might be tomorrow. Okay to stay? Of course, dear. He's already asleep. Be safe. Garrett stared at the phone, his son's face on the lock screen from last summer, smiling, gap-toothed. Perfect. What was he doing here, 1,000 miles from home, in a hospital waiting room for a woman who'd humiliated him 12 hours ago? But something had shifted on that flight, something he couldn't name or define but could feel changing the shape of his future. He closed his eyes, just for a minute, just to rest. The dream came immediately. No transition, no warning. Jason Rodriguez's face, young and terrified, the cockpit spinning around them. What do we do, Captain? What do we do? The alarm screaming, the ground rushing up, the sound of metal tearing itself apart under stresses it was never designed to withstand. Garrett's hands moving through procedures, through responses, through training that should have been enough, but wasn't. Never was. Garrett, he jerked awake. Kate stood in front of him, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who'd fought a war and wasn't sure if they'd won or lost. You were talking in your sleep. Garrett rubbed his face, trying to push away the images that clung like smoke. Bad dream. The crash. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Kate sat in the chair beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. We talked. My father and I. And it was hard. We said things. Honest things. She paused, her hands folded in her lap. he cried. I've never seen my father cry. First time for everything. I'm staying the night. Maybe a few days until she's stable. Kate turned to face him fully. The jet needs to go back to Chicago. The company needs it. I can fly it back. Kate shook her head. That's not what I'm asking. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folded paper, handed it to him. I'm asking you to stay, here in Miami, until I'm ready to go back. Ms. Sterling. Kate, please. Kate, I have a son at home. I know. I'll arrange for him to come here. Mrs. Brennan, too, if she's willing. First-class flights, hotel suite, whatever they need. Why? Kate was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the floor, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. Because for the first time in 4 years, I feel like something might be okay. And you're part of that. We met 12 hours ago. I know. She looked up at him, and in her eyes Garrett saw something he recognized, the mirror of his own isolation reflected back. And in those 12 hours, you've shown me more about courage and integrity than anyone has in years. She paused. I meant what I said on the jet, about owing you an apology, about being cruel. You already apologized. Words are cheap. Kate pulled out another piece of paper, unfolded it carefully. I want to do something real. When we get back to Chicago, I want you to read this. Garrett took the paper, didn't open it. What is it? A job offer. Senior pilot position. Sterling Aviation. Full salary. Benefits. Everything. Garrett's chest tightened, the air suddenly too thin. I'm a janitor. You're a test pilot who's been hiding for 8 years. There's a difference. I can't fly anymore. You flew today. That was different. How? Garrett looked at the paper in his hands, felt its weight, heavier than it should have been. When I quit, I made a promise to myself. No more cockpits, no more risking leaving Cole alone, and mopping floors is safer. It doesn't kill people. The words came out harsher than he intended, carrying 8 years of guilt compressed into 4 syllables. Kate's voice softened. Garrett, what happened to Lieutenant Rodriguez wasn't your fault. Everyone keeps saying that. Because it's true, then why does it feel like a lie? The question hung between them, raw and honest and unanswered. Kate didn't have a response. Nobody ever did. The silence stretched until Garrett stood, needing movement, needing distance from conversations that cut too close to bone. I should find a hotel. Stay at my father's place. Kate stood too. He offered, wants to talk to you about Edwards, about flying. She paused. About what it takes to come back from losing someone in the air. Garrett went still. Your father lost someone. His co-pilot. 1987. Engine fire over the Pacific. David Hansen. Kate's voice dropped. They'd been flying together for 15 years. Dad didn't fly for 2 years after that. Then he came back. Flew for another 25 years without a single incident. How? He said he realized something. That David wouldn't want him to stop. That the best way to honor him was to keep flying, to be better, to save the lives David couldn't. Garrett looked at her, this woman he'd known for less than a day, who somehow understood things about him that he'd never told anyone. One night. I'll stay one night. Kate smiled, small and genuine, the first real smile he'd seen from her. One night. James Sterling's house was a sprawling ranch on the outskirts of Miami, white walls and tile floors and aviation memorabilia covering every available surface. Garrett stood in the guest room looking at framed photographs. James in his United uniform shaking hands with presidents. James beside aircraft from every era of commercial aviation. James receiving awards and commendations and honors that spoke to a life spent mastering something most people only dreamed about. A knock on the door. Come in. James entered, changed out of his suit into a polo shirt and khakis, looking almost human without the armor of formal clothes. Getting settled? Yes, sir. Thank you for this. Drop the sir. You're not in the military anymore. James moved to the window, looked out at the darkness. Kate told me about your co-pilot, Lieutenant Rodriguez. Garrett tensed. every muscle locking up in anticipation of questions he didn't want to answer. I told her about David. James continued, still looking out the window. 1987. Seems like yesterday some days. Other days feels like a different lifetime. How did you get past it? James turned, his expression unreadable. Who says I got past it? Garrett waited. I didn't get past it. I got through it. There's a difference. I don't understand. Past means it's over. Done. Behind you. James walked to a framed photo on the desk, two men in pilot uniforms with arms around each other's shoulders. Through means you carry it with you. Every flight, every takeoff, every landing. Doesn't that make it worse? No. It makes it meaningful. James picked up the photo, held it like something precious. David Hansen. Best pilot I ever knew. Better than me, if I'm honest. The day he died, I wanted to die too. What changed? His wife, Maria. James set down the photo. 3 months after the crash, she showed up at my door. I thought she was going to scream at me. Blame me. I was ready for it. Hell, I wanted it. What did she do? She hugged me. James's voice cracked just slightly, just enough to show the man underneath the legend. Told me David would be furious if I quit flying. Said he'd haunt me for the rest of my life if I wasted the gift he saw in me. She was right. David would have been furious. He loved flying more than anything except Maria. To throw that away because of grief would have been an insult to everything he believed in. Garrett absorbed this, let it settle into the empty spaces where certainty used to live. My wife believed the same thing. Sarah. She always said I was born to fly. Kate told me she passed. Car accident. Yeah. 3 years ago. I'm sorry. Garrett looked at his hands, the same hands that had held Sarah as she died, that had carried Cole through his first steps, that had cleaned toilets for 2 years because it was the only work he trusted himself to do. She left me a letter. I found it after the funeral. Never opened it. James's eyebrows rose. Why not? Because I knew what it would say. That I should fly again. That I should stop hiding. That Cole needed to see his father whole. Garrett's voice cracked. And I wasn't ready to hear it. Are you ready now? The question cut deep. Deeper than anything Kate had asked. Deeper than anything Garrett had asked himself in 8 years of avoiding mirrors, both literal and metaphorical. I don't know. Then maybe it's time to find out. James walked to the door, paused. Get some sleep, Captain. Tomorrow, if you want, I'll show you something. What? James smiled, the expression genuine now, carrying warmth that transformed his entire face. The first aircraft I flew after David died. I keep it in the hangar out back. Old Cessna 172. Nothing fancy. But it's where I learned that flying wasn't about forgetting the dead. It's about honoring them. He left. Garrett stood alone in the guest room, the photographs staring down at him like silent witnesses. He pulled out his phone, found the contact he'd been avoiding. Mrs. Brennan answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the gentle concern of someone who'd watched him struggle for 3 years. Garrett? Everything all right, dear? Can you do something for me? Of course. What do you need? In my bedroom, top dresser drawer, there's a white envelope, Sarah's handwriting on the front. Can you take a picture and send it? Silence on the other end, heavy with understanding. Of course. Give me 5 minutes. Garrett sat on the bed, waited, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't articulate. His phone buzzed. The picture was slightly blurry, but he could read Sarah's handwriting clearly. For Garrett, when you're ready. He stared at it for a long time, traced the letters with his eyes, her handwriting, her words, her love still reaching out from beyond a grave that should have separated them forever. Then he typed, "Don't open it. I'll read it when I get home. But thank you. Is everything okay?" Garrett thought about the question, about the flight, about Kate, about James, about the door that had cracked open after 8 years of darkness. I think it might be, for the first time in a long time. He set down the phone, lay back on the bed, let himself remember Sarah. Not the accident, not the funeral, not the empty bed and the silence that followed. Her laugh, her smile, the way she would look at him when he talked about flying, like he was describing magic, like he was showing her a world she could only glimpse through his eyes. "You were born for the sky, baby." She used to say that, usually late at night when they were tangled together and the world felt small and manageable. Don't you ever forget that. He hadn't forgotten. He had just been too afraid to remember. The Cessna was older than Garrett. James pulled back the hangar doors the next morning, revealing a white and blue aircraft that looked like it belonged in a museum dedicated to aviation's simpler past. 1965. Bought her the day after David's funeral. Flew her for the first time 3 weeks later. 3 weeks. Couldn't do it sooner. James ran his hand along the wing, gentle, like touching an old friend. Kept walking to the hangar, sitting in the cockpit, then walking away. But eventually, the need to fly was stronger than the fear. Why keep her? Because she reminds me. James opened the cockpit door. Every time I look at her, I remember what it felt like to be so broken I couldn't move. And then I remember what it felt like to move anyway. He gestured to the pilot's seat. "Get in." Garrett hesitated. This isn't a G650. No autopilot, no fancy instruments, just you in the sky. James's voice was firm, carrying the authority of someone who'd taught thousands of pilots over decades of instruction. "If you can fly this, you can fly anything. I'm not checked out on small aircraft anymore. I am. I'll handle the legal side. You just fly." Garrett climbed into the left seat. The cockpit was cramped, claustrophobic compared to the spacious jets he'd flown in the Air Force. Basic gauges, analog everything, nothing to hide behind. Start the checklist. Garrett's hands moved, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. Master switch, fuel selector, mixture rich, clear prop. He turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, caught. The propeller spun into a blur. The sound was different from a jet, rougher, more immediate, more alive. Taxi to runway 24. Garrett released the brakes. The Cessna rolled forward, responding to his inputs with mechanical simplicity. His feet worked the rudder pedals, awkward at first like learning a foreign language, then smoother as ancient training reasserted itself. They reached the runway, empty except for them and the morning sun and the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "Your aircraft." Garrett pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared, a small roar, nothing like the scream of military jets, but real and honest and enough. The Cessna accelerated. 50 knots. 60. 70. Garrett pulled back on the yoke. The wheels left the ground. Everything changed. The noise fell away. The weight lifted. The horizon stretched infinite in every direction, unmarked by the constraints of roads or buildings or the limitations people accepted as inevitable. Garrett climbed. 500 feet. 1,000. 1,500. Below them, Miami spread out in morning light, the ocean glittering like scattered diamonds, the Everglades stretching green and endless toward a vanishing point that might have been the edge of the world. "How does it feel?" Garrett couldn't answer. His throat was too tight, blocked by something he didn't have words for and wouldn't have been able to voice, even if he did. "First time I flew after David, I cried for 20 minutes. James's voice was gentle now, stripped of authority, just one pilot talking to another. Just circled the field, crying like a baby. Couldn't help it. Garrett blinked. His vision was blurry. There's no shame in it. You're not just flying. You're coming home. Garrett leveled off at 3,000 feet. The Cessna hummed, steady and faithful, a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do without complaint or hesitation. I've been so angry. The words came without planning, pulled out by altitude and honesty and the particular clarity that comes from being suspended between earth and sky. At the aircraft that killed Jason, at the drunk driver who killed Sarah, at God, the universe, whatever. Just angry. Anger's easy. It's a wall you can hide behind. James pointed out the window. See that cloud? The one shaped like a fist. Garrett looked. A cumulus formation, bunched and tight, looking almost solid. That's what anger looks like. Tight, dense, ready to explode. James pointed higher. Now look at that one. A cirrus cloud, thin and stretched, spread across the sky like silk pulled to translucence. That's what anger becomes when you let it go. It doesn't disappear. It just expands, becomes part of something bigger. Garrett watched the clouds, the fist and the silk, the before and the after. How long did it take you? Years. And I'm still working on it. James shrugged. But that's the point. It's not about finishing. It's about trying. Every day, every flight. Garrett turned the Cessna, banked gently, the wing dipping toward the ocean. My son doesn't know I can fly. I never told him. Why not? Because if he knew, he'd want me to do it. And I wasn't ready to explain why I couldn't. Maybe it's time to show him instead of explaining. Garrett thought about Cole, 8 years old, asking questions, looking at the sky with the same wonder Garrett had felt at that age before the world taught him that wonder was dangerous, and love was temporary, and the people you trusted with your life could die screaming your name. You sure about this, Captain? Jason's voice, calm now, no longer panicked, no longer terrified, just present. Always present. Ready as I'll ever be, Lieutenant. Then let's show them what we can do. They flew for another 30 minutes, carving patterns in the morning air, writing messages in contrails that would fade before anyone on the ground could read them. Garrett felt something loosening in his chest, some knot that had been tied 8 years ago, finally beginning to unravel. Not gone, not healed, but different. Take us back. Garrett turned toward the airport. The Cessna descended, dropping through layers of air that felt like falling through time itself. Each 1,000 feet marking another year of running, another layer of fear, another excuse for not being who he used to be. The landing was rusty, a small bounce, embarrassing for someone who'd once been considered among the best pilots in the Air Force. But safe. Always safe. They taxied back to the hangar, shut down the engine. In the silence that followed, James spoke. Kate's been alone for a long time. She dates, goes to galas, has 100 people around her every day, but alone in the ways that matter. Why? Because she watched me push everyone away after David died, watched me become hard, cold, protected. James unbuckled his harness, and she learned it. Learned that vulnerability was weakness, that letting people in meant getting hurt. He climbed out of the aircraft, looked back at Garrett. But today, she let you in. A janitor she'd mocked, a stranger. She let you see her scared, crying, asking for help. That's not nothing, Captain, that's everything. I'm not looking for a relationship. Neither was I when I met Margaret. Neither is anyone when they meet the person who changes everything. James walked toward the house, paused, turned back. But here's the thing about change. It doesn't ask permission. It just happens, and you either fight it or flow with it. He disappeared into the house. Garrett sat in the cockpit alone, the instrument panel dark, the silence complete and profound. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had mopped floors for 2 years, that had landed a jet in a hurricane, that had held Sarah as she died, that had carried Cole through his first steps. They were capable of so much more than he had allowed them, so much more than fear had permitted. He climbed out of the Cessna, walked toward the house, toward whatever came next. Tomorrow, he would fly home. Tomorrow, he would read Sarah's letter. Tomorrow, he would tell Cole the truth. And maybe, just maybe, he would take the first step toward who he was meant to be instead of who he'd forced himself to become. The flight back to Chicago was different. Kate sat in the co-pilot seat this time, monitoring instruments with the basic knowledge James had taught her years ago before their relationship fractured under the weight of his expectations and her ambitions. You're different. Different how? Lighter. Like you set something down. Maybe I did. My father partly. And the Cessna. And just time, I guess. Kate nodded. Didn't push. Respected the boundaries he was still learning to define. I thought about your offer. The pilot job. And I need time. Have to talk to my son. Read something important. Figure some things out. Take all the time you need. You don't even know if I'll say yes. I know. Kate looked at him, and in her eyes was something that might have been faith, or might have been hope, or might have been the particular kind of certainty that comes from recognizing something you've been looking for without knowing you were searching. But something tells me you will. When you're ready. They landed in Chicago as the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that had no names and would exist for only minutes before fading into darkness. Marcus was waiting by the hangar, arms crossed, the hint of a smile on his weathered face. Heard you made quite an impression in Miami. Word travels fast. Instantly. Marcus's smile widened. Victoria's been losing her mind trying to figure out how a janitor landed a G650 in a hurricane. What's she saying? That you got lucky? That Kate's lost her mind? That the company's going to crash and burn if they give you a pilot position? She knows about the offer. Everyone knows. Kate made sure of it. Garrett looked at Kate. She shrugged, unapologetic. I wanted it official. No more hiding. No more pretending you're something you're not. The words hit Garrett somewhere deep, in the places he'd learned to protect through careful avoidance and strategic invisibility. No more hiding. No more pretending. That was exactly what he had been doing for 8 years. Hiding from the sky. Pretending to be a janitor. Living a life smaller than he was designed for. Safer than he was built to withstand. I need to get home. Cole's waiting. I'll have a car take you. Kate touched his arm, the gesture brief but weighted with meaning. Think about the offer. And Garrett? Yeah? Whatever you decide, thank you. For everything. He nodded, walked to the waiting car, felt the weight of eyes watching him cross the distance between who he'd been and who he might become. The drive home felt like crossing into another world, the same streets and buildings transformed by knowledge that couldn't be unlearned, understanding that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Brennan was dozing on the couch when he walked in, her knitting needles in her lap, the scarf she'd been working on for 6 months finally nearing completion. She woke at the sound of the door. You're back, dear. Sorry it took so long. Don't apologize. She stood, gathered her things with the efficient movements of someone who'd been doing this particular kindness for 3 years. Cole's asleep, been asking for you all day. Thank you for everything. Mrs. Brennan paused at the door, her hand on the knob, her eyes carrying the weight of things she'd seen and understood without needing explanation. That envelope. The one from Sarah. I found it. It's on your dresser. I know. Are you going to read it? Garrett took a breath, deeper than any breath he had taken in years, pulling air into lungs that had forgotten how to expand fully. Tonight. I'm going to read it tonight. Mrs. Brennan smiled. First time he had ever seen her smile like that, warm and hopeful and proud in a way that suggested she saw something in him that he was only beginning to glimpse in himself. Good. It's been waiting long enough. She left. Garrett walked to Cole's room, cracked the door, watched his son sleep curled on his side with the stuffed elephant under his arm, breathing slow and steady, safe in ways Garrett had spent 3 years ensuring and 8 years running from. He sat on the edge of the bed, watched his son breathe. Let the simple fact of Cole's existence anchor him to decisions he was about to make. I'm sorry I was gone. The words came out whisper soft. But I'm back. And things are going to be different now. I promise. Cole stirred, didn't wake, his face peaceful in the particular innocence of childhood sleep. Garrett kissed his forehead, stood, walked to his bedroom with steps that felt heavier than they should, weighted by anticipation and fear and the particular dread that comes from opening doors you've kept locked for years. The envelope sat on his dresser, exactly where Mrs. Brennan had left it. White. Sarah's handwriting clear and unmistakable. For Garrett. When you're ready. His hands shook as he picked it up. 3 years. 1,095 days since Sarah died. 1,095 days of carrying this letter like a talisman, like a grenade, like a message from a future that might save him or destroy him, depending on whether he had the courage to read it. He opened it. 3 pages. Her handwriting neat and clear, achingly familiar, so present he could almost hear her voice speaking the words as his eyes moved across them. My love, if you're reading this, it means 2 things. First, that something has happened to me. Second, that you're finally ready to hear what I've been wanting to tell you for years. Garrett's vision blurred. He wiped his eyes, kept reading. I know you stopped flying because of Jason. I know you blame yourself, even though everyone says it wasn't your fault. And I know that no matter what I say, you'll carry that weight until you decide to set it down. He could hear her voice, like she was sitting beside him, like she had never left, like death was just another room in a house they still shared. But here's what I need you to understand. You are not your worst moment. You are not the crash. You are not the failure. His throat tightened. You are the man who held me when I cried. The man who stayed up all night with Cole when he was sick. The man who works a job he hates just to keep us safe. Tears fell onto the paper. He didn't wipe them away. You are brave. You are strong. You are exactly the man I fell in love with. And one day, when you're ready, I need you to fly again. Not for me. For Cole. He needs to see his father whole. He needs to know that mistakes don't define us, that failure isn't final, that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward anyway. Garrett had to stop, had to breathe. The words were too heavy, too true, too exactly what he needed to hear and had been too afraid to face. I wish I could be there when you get back in the cockpit. I wish I could see your face when you remember who you really are. But if I can't, I need you to know this. I am so proud of you, not for what you achieve, but for who you are. For the man who keeps trying even when it hurts. For the father who loves our son more than anything. For the pilot who will fly again when the time is right. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the paper. He read it again, and again, and a third time. By the second reading, the tears had slowed. By the third, he understood what she had been trying to tell him across the barrier of death and time and 3 years of grieving. He wasn't broken. He had never been broken. He had just been waiting. There was a postscript at the bottom, almost missed. P.S. When you tell Cole about your flying days, tell him I knew you'd find your way back. Tell him his daddy is a hero, not because he never falls, but because he always gets back up. Garrett set down the letter, walked back to Cole's room, sat beside his son's bed. Cole. He shook him gently. Wake up, buddy. Cole's eyes fluttered open, confused and sleepy. Dad? You're home. I'm home. And I have to tell you something. Cole sat up, rubbed his eyes with small fists. What? Garrett took a breath, deeper than any breath he had taken in his life, pulling in air that tasted like possibility and tasted like courage and tasted like truth. I used to be a pilot, a long time ago, before you were born. I flew jets, big ones, fast ones. Cole's eyes went wide, sleep forgotten. Really? Really. But something bad happened and I stopped flying. I was scared. Scared of what? Of flying again. Of losing people I love. Garrett's voice cracked, but he pushed through. Of not being there for you. Cole was quiet, processing, his 8-year-old mind working through implications that most adults spent lifetimes avoiding. "But you flew to Miami," Mrs. Brennan told me. "You flew a big plane in a storm." "I did." "So you're not scared anymore?" Garrett considered the question, really considered it, gave his son the truth instead of the comfort. "I'm still scared, but I'm going to try anyway." Cole smiled, that gap-toothed grin that looked so much like Sarah it made Garrett's heart ache. "Mom said you would." Garrett's heart stopped. "What?" "Before she went to heaven." Cole's voice was matter-of-fact, accepting death with the pragmatism of children who haven't learned that some things are supposed to be permanent. "She told me that you used to fly, that one day you'd fly again. She said I should be proud of you when it happened." Garrett pulled his son close, held him tight, let the weight of Sarah's love wrap around them both like a blanket woven from hope and sacrifice, and the particular magic that comes from being known completely by another person. "Are you proud of me?" "Yeah, Dad." Cole's arms wrapped around his neck. "I'm super proud." They stayed like that for a long time, father and son, holding on to each other in the darkness, anchoring each other against futures neither could predict and pasts neither could change. When Garrett finally let go, something had shifted inside him. Some weight he had carried for 8 years not gone but transformed, transmuted from lead into something that might one day become gold. "Go back to sleep, buddy. Will you fly again?" "For real?" Garrett looked at his son, at Sarah's eyes in that small face, at the trust and hope and certainty that children carry before the world teaches them to doubt. "Yeah, I think I will." Cole smiled, lay back down, was asleep within seconds. Garrett walked to the window, looked up at the sky, at the stars flying past, millions of them, each one a destination he might someday reach if he found the courage to try. He pulled out his phone, found Kate's number, typed one word. "Yes." 3 dots appeared. Then, "I knew you would. See you Monday, Captain Sullivan." Garrett smiled, first real smile in longer than he could remember, first smile that felt like it came from somewhere deeper than politeness or obligation. He was going to fly again. And this time, nothing would stop him. The final 2 weeks before Dubai disappeared in a blur of training that pushed Garrett past every limit he thought he had. Commander Wright designed sequences that would have broken most pilots, precision maneuvers at altitudes where margin for error existed only in theory, vertical climbs that tested the aircraft's structural integrity, approaches at angles that seemed to defy physics until they didn't. But the real challenge came on a Tuesday morning when Kate called him to her office with an expression that suggested she was about to ask for something impossible. "There's a finale." She pulled up a video on her tablet, the footage grainy and dated. "My father designed it in 1986. No one's flown it since he retired." Garrett watched the screen. A younger James Sterling at the controls executing a maneuver that looked like it belonged in a fever dream rather than actual aviation. The aircraft spiraled upward in an ever-tightening corkscrew, climbing and rotating simultaneously until it reached an apex where it seemed to hang motionless, suspended between earth and sky like a magic trick, before pivoting into a controlled descent that required timing measured in fractions of seconds. "That's impossible." Kate's smile was small, knowing. "My father did it 237 times over 20 years, never failed once, never even came close to failing. And you want me to do it, I want you to try." Kate set down the tablet. "It's called the Sterling Spiral. If you can execute it in Dubai in front of 50,000 people and 200 million viewers, it won't just be a demonstration. It'll be legend." Garrett watched the video again, his pilot's brain automatically calculating G-forces and rotation rates and the 1,000 variables that would have to align perfectly for this to work. "And if I can't?" "Then we do something else." Kate's voice softened. "But I've watched you fly, Garrett. I've seen what you can do when you stop thinking and start trusting." If anyone can bring this back, it's you. The first 15 attempts were catastrophic in ways that made failure feel inevitable. Too slow, and the aircraft stalled before reaching the apex. Too fast, and the spiral widened into uselessness. Too steep, and the G-forces built toward unconsciousness. The simulator punished every miscalculation with digital death, reminding Garrett that in the real aircraft there would be no reset button, no second chances, no room for almost. Commander Wright watched Attempt 12 with growing concern. Maybe we should consider a backup finale. No. Garrett, this maneuver has a 90% failure rate, even among pilots who've been practicing it for months. You've had 2 weeks. Then I need to practice more. There's brave and there's stupid. Wright's Texas drawl made the words sound almost gentle. You're pushing towards stupid. I can do this. Wanting to and being able to are different things. Then watch me prove they're not. Attempt 16 nearly killed him, even in the simulator. The spiral tightened too quickly. The G-forces built too fast. His vision narrowed to a pinpoint before the whole world went gray, and the simulation ended with a crash that would have left nothing but debris and regret. Garrett sat in the dark cockpit afterward, hands shaking, wondering if Kate's faith in him was misplaced, if some maneuvers were impossible for a reason, if legends should stay where they belonged, in the past, performed by people who weren't carrying the weight of everyone they'd already failed. His phone buzzed. Text from Cole. Tommy's dad said you're going to crash in Dubai. I told him he's wrong. You won't crash, right, Dad? Garrett stared at the message, at the faith compressed into 7 words, at the trust his son placed in abilities Garrett wasn't sure he possessed. He thought about Sarah's letter, about flying for something instead of away from it, about what it meant to be a hero in the eyes of an 8-year-old boy who still believed his father was invincible. He climbed back into the simulator. Attempt 17, the breakthrough came on attempt 23 at 2 in the morning, when exhaustion had burned through the part of his brain that tried to control everything and left only instinct. Garrett stopped thinking about the maneuver and started feeling it, let his hands move without conscious direction, trusted the aircraft to respond the way physics demanded, rather than the way fear suggested. The spiral tightened. The G-forces built. 3, 4, 5, the weight of multiple selves pressing down. His vision narrowed, but he'd learned to fly through that, to trust instruments when eyes betrayed. The aircraft climbed and rotated, scribing a helix in virtual sky that would have been beautiful if there'd been time to appreciate beauty. The apex approached, the moment when the aircraft would either pivot into history or tumble into failure. Garrett felt it in his bones before his instruments confirmed it, the precise instant when upward momentum equaled gravitational pull, when the aircraft hung motionless like a hummingbird, considering its options. Now, he kicked the rudder, pulled the yoke with pressure calibrated through hundreds of hours of training and thousands of hours of flight time accumulated across a lifetime of choosing the sky. The aircraft pivoted. Clean, perfect, controlled. For one impossible second, it pointed straight up at stars the simulator couldn't show, balanced on thrust alone, defying everything that wanted to pull it down. Then gravity reasserted itself, and Garrett was falling, nose down, accelerating, the altimeter unwinding like a countdown to either triumph or disaster. He held the dive longer than felt safe, longer than training suggested, trusting the physics he'd spent decades learning to respect. At the last possible moment, he pulled back. The aircraft leveled. The simulation stabilized. The maneuver was complete. Commander Wright's voice came through the headset after a silence that felt like judgment. Time. 4 minutes, 8 seconds. All parameters within tolerance. Another pause. My God, Sullivan, you actually did it. Garrett didn't respond, couldn't respond. His hands were shaking too badly, and his throat was too tight with something that might have been relief, or might have been the realization that impossible was just another word for difficult until you did it. Again. What? I need to do it again. Make sure it wasn't luck. He did it again, and again. 6 more times, each execution cleaner than the last, each pivot more precise, each recovery more controlled. By the 7th repetition, the maneuver felt less like fighting physics and more like dancing with it. A conversation between pilot and aircraft conducted in a language of thrust and drag, and the particular poetry that exists only in 3-dimensional space. When he finally climbed out of the simulator, Kate was waiting. She'd been there for all 7 attempts, watching through the observation window, her face showing emotions Garrett couldn't quite read. Pride mixed with something that looked almost like fear. Hope tempered with the understanding that what worked in simulation would be exponentially harder in actual sky with actual consequences. You did it. In a simulator. You did it 7 times in a row. Kate stepped closer. My father practiced for 3 months before he felt confident enough to try it in actual flight. You've had 2 weeks. Your father didn't have 8 years of guilt to work through. No. Kate's voice softened, but he had 2 years of it. And he said, the day he first executed the Sterling Spiral was the day he finally forgave himself for David's death. Like the maneuver proved something about skill versus circumstance, like perfection in the present could balance failure in the past. Garrett thought about Jason Rodriguez, about the voice in his head that had evolved from panic to pride, about whether redemption could be earned through executing a maneuver named after someone else's dead friend. Does it work? What? Forgiving yourself. Kate was quiet for a long moment. Ask me in Dubai. 2 days before departure, the call came from Cole's school. Garrett was in the middle of a practice session when his phone buzzed with the principal's number, and he knew before answering that something had gone wrong in ways that had nothing to do with aviation and everything to do with the particular cruelty of 8-year-old boys who measured worth through their father's occupations. Mr. Sullivan, we need you to come pick up Cole. There's been an incident. Is he hurt? He's been in a fight. The principal's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news to a parent who might react unpredictably. The other boy has a bloody nose. Cole has some bruising around his eye. I'll be right there. The drive to the school felt longer than the flight to Miami. Every red light an eternity. Every mile weighted with the knowledge that his son had been hurt, and Garrett hadn't been there to prevent it. He found Cole sitting outside the principal's office, ice pack pressed against his left eye, expression defiant in a way that didn't quite hide the hurt underneath. What happened? Tommy said you're going to crash in Dubai. Cole's voice was tight, controlled, the voice of someone trying very hard not to cry. He said his dad read that you're a fake pilot, that you're just a janitor pretending to be something you're not. He said everyone knows you're going to fail. And what did you say? I said you're a hero, that you flew through a hurricane and passed tests that nobody passes, and you're going to Dubai to show the whole world how good you are. Cole's face crumpled slightly, and they laughed. All of them. They laughed like it was the funniest thing they ever heard. Garrett knelt down, ignored the principal hovering nearby, focused entirely on his son. So you hit him. He said you were a loser, that I was a loser for believing in you. Cole pulled the ice pack away, revealing a bruise that was already darkening to purple. I couldn't let him say that, Dad. I couldn't. For a moment, Garrett couldn't speak, couldn't find words adequate to the weight of what his son had just said, to the faith compressed into violence, to the particular burden of being 8 years old and defending a father who'd spent 8 years hiding. He pulled Cole close, held him tight, let the school and the principal and the consequences wait while he dealt with something more important. You know what makes someone a hero, buddy? Cole shook his head against Garrett's chest. Not never falling. Heroes fall all the time. They fail and they mess up, and sometimes they look like losers to people who don't understand what it takes to keep trying. Garrett pulled back, looked his son in the eye. Heroes are people who get back up, Who try again even when everyone laughs? Who keep going because the people they love believe in them even when they don't believe in themselves? Are you a hero, Dad? I'm trying to be. Garrett's voice caught. For you. Always for you. Cole hugged him again, fierce and tight, 8 years old and already understanding things about courage that most adults never learned. You won't crash in Dubai, right? I'll do everything I can not to. Promise? Garrett thought about the Sterling spiral, about the 90% failure rate, about 50,000 people watching and 200 million more on screens around the world. He thought about Jason Rodriguez and Sarah and every person who'd ever trusted him with something precious. I promise I'll give it everything I have. That's good enough. The suspension was 3 days. Garrett spent them with Cole, taking him to the simulator, showing him the cockpit of the Gulfstream, explaining the physics of flight in terms an 8-year-old could understand. On the 3rd day, Cole asked to see the Sterling spiral on video. They watched together, James Sterling's younger self executing the maneuver with precision that looked effortless but had required thousands of hours to achieve. Cole's eyes went wide as the aircraft spiraled upward, hung motionless, pivoted into descent. You're going to do that? I'm going to try. In front of everyone? In front of everyone. Cole was quiet for a long moment, processing implications. What if you mess up? Then I mess up in front of everyone and we deal with it. But you won't mess up. How do you know? Cole smiled, that gap-toothed grin that looked so much like Sarah it made Garrett's heart ache. Because you're my dad, and my dad doesn't give up. The flight to Dubai was 14 hours of anticipation compressed into a metal tube traveling at 600 miles per hour. Cole spent the first 3 hours glued to the window, watching clouds that looked like continents and oceans that stretched to horizons that seemed infinite. Mrs. Brennan knitted something that might have been a scarf, her needles clicking in rhythm with the engines. Marcus played chess against himself on a magnetic board, occasionally offering observations about strategy that applied equally to games and flying. Kate sat beside Garrett, neither of them sleeping despite the overnight flight, both too wired to rest. You nervous? Terrified. You don't look terrified. I've had a lot of practice hiding it. Garrett glanced at her. You? Kate considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I'm afraid you'll succeed and everything will change. I'm afraid you'll fail and I'll have pushed you into something that destroys you. I'm afraid either way I'm going to lose something I didn't know I needed until I met you. Garrett reached for her hand, laced his fingers through hers, the gesture feeling both natural and terrifying in its intimacy. You're not going to lose me. You can't promise that. No. But I can promise I'll try. Same way I promised Cole. What did you promise him? That I'd give it everything I had? Kate squeezed his hand. That's all anyone can ask. They landed in Dubai at dawn, the city rising from desert like a hallucination made real, towers of glass and steel that seemed to defy gravity through sheer force of wealth and will. The heat hit them like a physical blow when they stepped off the aircraft, 108 degrees Fahrenheit. The air shimmering with temperatures that made Chicago's summer feel like Arctic tundra. Cole's eyes went wide. Dad, this place is huge. Yeah, buddy. It is. Are you going to fly over all of it? Some of it. Cool. The hotel was 5-star luxury that made Garrett uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Marble floors and gold fixtures and staff who anticipated needs before you knew you had them. Kate had arranged suites for everyone, rooms larger than his apartment in Rogers Park, views that overlooked the exhibition grounds where 50,000 seats waited to be filled. The Sterling Aviation delegation had their own wing. Marcus immediately claimed the room with the best view of the runway. Mrs. Brennan marveled at bathroom fixtures that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Cole discovered a television with more channels than seemed physically possible. and settled in to watch aviation documentaries in preparation for tomorrow's demonstration. Garrett stood on the balcony of his suite, looking out at the massive exhibition complex, at the aircraft from 40 countries gleaming in desert sun, at the infrastructure built to showcase humanity's conquest of sky. Somewhere down there was the Gulf Stream he would fly tomorrow, the same aircraft that had carried him to Miami 6 weeks ago when he'd been a janitor with a secret, and Kate Sterling had been a woman who didn't know his name. 6 weeks. It felt like 6 years. It felt like 6 minutes. It felt like a lifetime compressed into the space between who he'd been and who he was becoming. His phone buzzed. Text from Kate. "Dinner with my father and the Orion Industries people at 8. Wear something nice. You're the guest of honor." Garrett looked down at himself, still in the flight suit he'd worn for the journey, and wondered when he'd become the kind of person who got invited to dinners where he was the guest of honor rather than the person who cleaned up afterward. The gala dinner was everything Garrett had feared. Crystal and champagne and conversations conducted in the language of wealth and power that he'd never learned to speak fluently. But James Sterling appeared at his elbow early in the evening, intercepting the worst of the small talk, running interference with the grace of someone who'd spent decades navigating these waters. "They want to own you." James's voice was low, meant only for Garrett. "Everyone in this room sees dollar signs when they look at you. The pilot who came back from the dead, the janitor who became a legend. They'll want endorsements, contracts, exclusive rights to tell your story. What should I do?" James smiled. "Whatever you want. You've got the leverage now. Use it wisely." The CEO of Orion Industries found them before dessert, a man named Harrison Chen, who'd built an aerospace empire through a combination of innovation and ruthlessness. "Captain Sullivan, I've been looking forward to meeting you." "Mr. Chen." "Harrison, please." Chen's handshake was firm, calculated to convey strength without aggression. "I wanted to discuss an opportunity. We're launching a new pilot training program focused on emergency procedures and extreme weather flying. We'd like you to be the face of it." "I'm flattered, but $2 million for the first year." Chen said it like he was ordering coffee. "Plus royalties on any training materials that use your name or likeness. We're talking about building the next generation of pilots who can handle what you handled over Miami." Garrett's mind went blank. $2 million was more money than he'd made in his entire life combined. More money than he'd ever imagined having. Enough money to secure Cole's future and buy a house and never worry about rent again. "I'll need to think about it." "Of course." Chen handed him a business card. "Call me after Dubai. After you've shown the world what you can do." After Chen left, James leaned close. "That's the low end of what you're worth. Don't sell yourself cheap. I don't even know what expensive looks like." James laughed, genuine and warm. "You're about to find out." Kate found Garrett later, on a balcony overlooking the city, away from the crowds and the champagne and the weight of expectations that felt heavier than any G-force. "You looked overwhelmed in there." $2 million. Garrett said it like he was testing the words, seeing if they sounded real when spoken aloud. "For teaching people how to fly. For being exceptional at something that matters." Kate stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "For being willing to share what you know with people who need to learn it. I was a janitor 6 weeks ago, and now you're not." Kate turned to face him. "You know what's amazing about you? You still don't see it. You still think you're the invisible man mopping floors, but everyone else sees what you really are." "What's that?" "Someone worth believing in." The moment stretched, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to name. Garrett thought about kissing her, about closing the distance and making real what had been building between them since Miami. But tomorrow was too important, the stakes too high, the margin for distraction too narrow. "I should get some sleep." Kate nodded, understanding without him having to explain. Tomorrow you make history. Or crash trying. You won't crash. Her voice carried certainty Garrett didn't feel. Because you're flying for something now, not away from it. And that makes all the difference. The morning of the demonstration arrived with the weight of inevitability. Garrett woke at 4 a.m., unable to sleep, his mind running through the Sterling spiral again and again, each iteration finding new ways to fail. He went through his pre-flight ritual, stretches to keep his body loose, breathing exercises to keep his mind clear, visualization of every maneuver from takeoff to landing. At 7 a.m., Kate knocked on his door with breakfast she'd ordered from room service. "You need to eat. I'll throw up. Then throw up. But eat first." He managed toast and eggs, simple and bland, his stomach accepting fuel it would need for the physical demands ahead. Cole appeared at 7:30, already dressed, already excited, bouncing with the particular energy of 8-year-olds who haven't learned that some things are worth being nervous about. "Today's the day, Dad. Today's the day. Are you scared?" "A little. Mom used to say being scared means you're about to do something brave." Garrett pulled his son close, grateful for Sarah's wisdom delivered through their child's voice, grateful for the reminder that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. She was right about a lot of things. The final briefing at 9 a.m. was mercifully brief. Commander Wright reviewed the flight plan one last time, her Texas drawl somehow making the extreme danger sound almost routine. 17 minutes of airspace, complete control. Weather is perfect, clear skies, minimal wind, visibility unlimited. "And the crowd?" Marcus asked. 52,000 tickets sold. Kate's voice carried pride she didn't try to hide. Plus global broadcast to an estimated 215 million viewers across 43 countries. Garrett's stomach turned. No pressure. All the pressure. Kate met his eyes. "That's why you trained." At 11:30, Garrett walked to the aircraft. The ground crew had prepared everything. The Gulf Stream sat gleaming in desert sun, every surface polished, every system checked and rechecked. The crowd was already gathering, 50,000 people finding their seats, cameras positioning themselves for optimal angles, commentators warming up their voices for narration that would shape how the world understood what they were about to witness. Cole and Mrs. Brennan were in the VIP section, front row, seats Kate had personally selected for optimal viewing. Marcus stood with the ground crew, arms crossed, that small smile on his weathered face that said he'd known all along this is where Garrett belonged. James Sterling sat beside his wife Margaret, who'd insisted on coming despite her doctor's protests, both of them watching with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. Garrett climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, weighted by expectation and opportunity, and the knowledge that in 17 minutes he would either validate everyone's faith or confirm every doubt. He paused at the door, looked back at the crowd, at the cameras, at the impossible scale of what he'd agreed to do. And there in the front row, his son waved, smiling, believing, certain in ways that only children could be certain that their fathers were invincible. Garrett waved back. Then he entered the cockpit. The familiar embrace of the pilot's seat grounded him, transformed nerves into focus, channeled anxiety into the sharp clarity required for precision flying. His hands moved through the pre-flight checklist with automatic competence, muscle memory built over thousands of hours taking over where conscious thought would have been too slow. Sterling Tower. This is Sterling 1 requesting clearance for demonstration flight. Sterling 1, you are cleared for demonstration. Runway 27. Wind calm. Visibility unlimited. A pause, then, "The sky is yours, Captain." Garrett taxied to the runway, the Gulfstream responding to his inputs with mechanical precision. He reached the threshold, stopped, took a breath that was part meditation and part prayer. His hands were steady on the controls. His mind was clear. His purpose was singular. You ready, Captain? Jason Rodriguez's voice, but different now. No panic, no fear, just the calm presence of someone who'd already faced the worst and come through it changed. Always ready, Lieutenant. Then let's show them what we can do. Garrett pushed the throttle forward. The engines roared, the aircraft accelerated, the runway blurred. At rotation speed, he pulled back on the yoke, felt the wheels leave the ground, felt the particular freedom that came from leaving Earth behind, and for the first time in 8 years, Garrett Sullivan wasn't just flying. He was free. Dubai fell away beneath him. The exhibition grounds became a patchwork of colors and shapes. The city stretched toward horizons marked by desert meeting sky. Garrett climbed to demonstration altitude, leveled off at 8,000 feet, began the sequence that 50,000 people had paid to watch and 200 million more would see on screens around the world. The first maneuver was a vertical climb that pushed the Gulf Stream to its performance limits. Garrett pointed the nose skyward, watched the altimeter spin, felt G-forces press him into the seat as the aircraft clawed for altitude. At 12,000 feet he rolled, the horizon flipping, desert becoming sky and sky becoming desert in a disorienting dance of perspective. The crowd gasped. Garrett heard it even through the cockpit, a collective intake of breath from 50,000 throats. He dove, controlled, precise. The ground rushed up with violence that looked suicidal from the outside, but felt calculated from within. At the last possible moment, he pulled back, the aircraft leveling with forces that strained the airframe but stayed within tolerances. Nice one, Captain. Just getting started. The next sequence was high G turns, figure eights at 300 knots that pushed both pilot and machine toward their limits. Each turn tighter than the last. Each one executed with precision that looked effortless but required total concentration. The commentator's voice, piped through speakers to the crowd, described what they were seeing in terms that made it sound almost simple. Remarkable precision from Captain Sullivan. These turns are at the absolute edge of what's possible in a civilian aircraft. Garrett didn't hear. He was somewhere else. In the zone. In the flow. In that particular state where time dilated and the world narrowed to nothing but aircraft and sky and the purity of physical laws that worked the same whether anyone was watching or not. 7 minutes in, the crowd was on their feet. Garrett executed a hammerhead turn, vertical climb, 0 airspeed at the apex, perfect pivot, vertical dive, textbook, beautiful. Then the inverted pass, flying upside down at 500 feet with the ground above him and sky below in a reversal that defied instinct. The crowd roared. Cameras captured angles that would become iconic, images that would define his career, moments that would be replayed and analyzed and celebrated. 11 minutes. Halfway through. Garrett climbed back to altitude, caught his breath, prepared for what was coming. The Sterling spiral. The maneuver that had broken him 15 times in simulation before he'd learned to execute it. The maneuver that 90% of pilots failed even after months of practice. The maneuver that would either make him legend or prove he'd reached beyond his capability. You sure about this? Jason's voice, curious but not worried, present but not intrusive. No. But I'm doing it anyway. That's my captain. Garrett banked left, began the entry. The spiral started wide, gradual, building momentum through careful calibration of bank angle and thrust. Then it tightened. The aircraft curved inward, climbing all the while, scribing a helix against blue sky that would have been beautiful if there'd been time for aesthetic appreciation. The G-forces built. 3, 4, 5. Garrett's body weighed 5 times normal, his arms lead, his chest struggling to expand against pressure that wanted to crush. But his hands stayed steady. His mind stayed clear. His focus stayed absolute. The spiral continued, tighter, higher. the aircraft corkscrewing toward heaven in defiance of gravity and common sense, and every voice that said this was impossible. 6 Gs. His vision narrowed, gray creeping in at the edges like curtains closing on consciousness. He breathed against the pressure, fought to stay present, to maintain control through forces that wanted to strip it away. The apex approached. The moment of truth. The instant where the aircraft would either hang motionless in a perfect demonstration of physics and skill, or tumble into the catastrophic failure that statistics said was inevitable. Garrett felt it in his bones before instruments confirmed it. The precise microsecond when upward momentum balanced gravitational pull, when the aircraft existed in that impossible space between rising and falling, suspended in three-dimensional space like a photograph of something that shouldn't exist. Now. He kicked the rudder, pulled the yoke. Timing calibrated through 23 failures and 7 successes, through muscle memory and mathematical precision and the particular faith required to trust that physics would work the way it always worked. The aircraft pivoted, clean, perfect, controlled. For one impossible second it hung there, pointing straight up at sky that stretched to infinity, balanced on thrust alone, defying everything that wanted to pull it down. 50,000 people held their breath. 200 million viewers leaned closer to screens. The world paused. Then gravity reasserted itself, and Garrett was falling, nose down, accelerating, the altimeter unwinding in a countdown to either triumph or disaster. He held the dive longer than felt safe, longer than training suggested, trusting physics, trusting the aircraft, trusting himself in ways he hadn't trusted anything in 8 years. At the last possible moment, he pulled back. The aircraft leveled. The recovery was complete. The Sterling spiral, perfect. For the first time in 30 years, the crowd exploded. 50,000 people on their feet, the roar audible even through the cockpit. A wall of sound that felt almost physical. The commentator's voice broke with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just witnessed aviation history. Captain Garrett Sullivan has successfully executed the Sterling spiral, the first pilot to perform this maneuver in 3 decades. But Garrett wasn't listening to commentators or crowds. He was listening to a different voice. "Hell of a job, Captain." "Thanks, Lieutenant. Couldn't have done it without you. You did it without me. I was just along for the ride." The final 3 minutes were a victory lap. Gentle maneuvers, graceful turns, a celebration of flight itself. Garrett brought the aircraft down in a long, slow approach, savoring the last moments of a flight he would remember for the rest of his life. The wheels touched soft as a whisper. The rollout was perfect. He taxied to the display area, shut down the engines. Silence. Then the cockpit door opened and sound hit him like a physical force. Cheering, screaming, his name being chanted by 50,000 throats in unison. "Sullivan! Sullivan! Sullivan!" Garrett climbed out, stood on the stairs, overwhelmed by the scale of what he'd just accomplished, by the weight of validation and redemption and proof that second chances were real if you were brave enough to take them. But he wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the VIP section. At Cole, who had broken through the barrier and was running across the tarmac. 8 years old, and sprinting with the particular abandon of children who haven't learned fear. At Kate, who was crying, her professional composure shattered by emotion she couldn't contain. At James Sterling, standing beside his wife, both of them on their feet, both of them applauding with the rest of the world. Cole reached him first. Garrett jumped down from the stairs, caught his son, lifted him high. "Dad! Dad, that was amazing. You think so? Everyone's clapping. They're saying your name. You did it." "Yeah, buddy, I did it." Kate arrived next, threw her arms around both of them, her tears soaking into Garrett's flight suit. "You did it. You actually did it. Told you I would. You told me nothing. She laughed through tears. You just flew like an angel and made everyone fall in love with you. Everyone? She looked at him, and in her eyes Garrett saw everything she wasn't saying, everything neither of them was quite ready to name, but both knew was true. Everyone. The rest of the day was chaos compressed into hours. Press conferences where Garrett answered questions with honesty that surprised reporters accustomed to corporate polish. Interviews where he talked about Jason Rodriguez and Sarah and the 8 years of running that had led to this moment of standing still. Handshakes with dignitaries from countries he couldn't name. Congratulations from pilots who'd watched him execute something they'd only read about in James Sterling's textbook. Harrison Chen found him in the evening, contract already prepared, $2 million in year one and escalating percentages for everything that followed. Garrett signed it in a daze, his signature on documents that would change his life in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. James Sterling appeared as the sun was setting, the exhibition grounds emptying, the crowds dispersing to hotels and homes and countries scattered across the globe. My father designed that maneuver 60 years ago. I flew it for 20 years. His voice cracked just slightly, just enough to show the man underneath the legend. I have never, in all my years of aviation, seen it executed better than what you just did. I had a good teacher. You had talent. That's different. James gripped his shoulder. Welcome to the family, son. The gala that night was everything the previous evening's dinner had promised. Crystal and champagne and conversations conducted by people who saw Garrett differently now, who looked at the janitor turned captain and saw someone worth courting, worth knowing, worth being associated with in photographs and partnerships, and all the ways that wealth and influence replicated themselves. Kate found him on a balcony again, away from the crowds, looking out at a city that glittered like someone had scattered diamonds across darkness. You did it. We did it. No. She stepped closer. This was you. All you. I just gave you the chance. You gave me everything. She was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Garrett felt the weight of what neither of them had been brave enough to say, the truth that had been building since Miami and had crystallized somewhere over Dubai in the moment when impossible became inevitable. Kate? Yeah? About that offer you made. The one about giving me anything I want. Kate's breath caught. That was cruel. I've apologized, I know. Garrett turned to face her fully. But here's the thing. I'm not sure it's a joke anymore either. What are you saying? I'm saying that somewhere between Miami and Dubai, between being invisible and being seen, I fell in love with you. With your courage when you asked me to fly scared. With your faith when I didn't have any. With the way you look at me like I'm someone worth believing in, even when I'm not sure I believe in myself. Garrett, I'm saying I don't know what that means yet. I've got a son who needs stability and a career that's just starting and a lot of baggage that doesn't disappear overnight. But I know that when I look at you, I see possibility. I see a future I didn't think I could have. I see someone who makes me want to be better than I was. Kate's eyes were wet. Is that a yes? It's a maybe. A strong maybe. Because maybe is all I have right now. Then I'll take it. She stepped closer, close enough to kiss. Close enough that Garrett could see gold flecks in blue eyes that had looked at him differently than anyone had looked at him in 8 years. Because maybe is more than I've had with anyone else. They stood there for a long moment, suspended between who they'd been and who they were becoming, the city glittering below them like a promise neither could quite articulate but both could feel. Tomorrow they would fly home. Tomorrow reality would reassert itself and contracts would need to be negotiated and lives would need to be lived. But tonight they were just two people who'd found each other through impossible circumstances, standing on a balcony in Dubai, looking at stars that seemed close enough to touch. The flight home was quieter than the journey out, everyone exhausted by adrenaline's aftermath, by the emotional weight of witnessing something that would be replayed and analyzed and celebrated for years. Cole slept with his head on Mrs. Brennan's lap, dreaming of aircraft and spirals and a father who'd proven that heroes were real. Marcus played chess against himself, occasionally shaking his head in wonder at moves that paralleled what he'd watched Garrett execute in Sky. Kate sat beside Garrett, both of them pretending to sleep but actually just thinking, processing, trying to understand how 6 weeks could compress a lifetime of change into a space that felt both infinite and impossibly brief. Somewhere over the Atlantic, she reached for his hand. What happens now? Garrett thought about the question, about contracts and training programs and the life that waited in Chicago. Now we figure it out. Together. If you want. I want. The landing in Chicago felt like coming home and arriving somewhere new simultaneously. The hangar was full. Sterling aviation staff who'd stayed late to welcome back the pilot who'd made history, reporters who wanted local angles on the Dubai story, and in the front of the crowd, holding a banner that read, "Welcome home, Captain Dad," Cole's second-grade class led by Mrs. Patterson, who'd started this whole thing by teaching about pilots and heroes. Garrett stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at faces that saw him differently now, that had watched him transform from invisible to inevitable, from janitor to legend. He thought about Sarah's letter, about flying for something instead of away from it, about the particular courage required to accept that redemption was possible if you were brave enough to try. Then he descended the stairs and stepped into a future he'd spent 8 years running from and 6 weeks running toward, ready to discover what came next. 1 year later, Garrett stood in the same hangar where he'd once mopped floors, but the building felt different now, transformed by purpose from a place he'd hidden into a place he belonged. The Sterling Aviation Youth Mentorship Program occupied the entire West Wing. 200 students across 3 locations, corporate sponsors lined up to fund expansion, waiting lists that stretched into the hundreds. Deshaun Thompson, 18 years old and home from the Air Force Academy for the summer, was teaching a class of 15-year-olds the basics of aerodynamics, his hands moving through explanations the same way Garrett's had moved when teaching him a year ago. The cycle continuing, the gift multiplying, the particular magic of knowledge shared becoming knowledge owned. Cole, now 9, ran through the hangar chasing a paper airplane he'd designed according to principles he'd learned from watching his father teach. Taller, more confident. No longer the kid whose classmates mocked his father's occupation. Now the kid whose friends asked for autographs and photographs and stories about what it was like to watch history happen from the front row. Kate was in her office, running the company James had built and she had transformed. The framed photograph on her desk showing her and Garrett at the Dubai Gala, both of them looking at each other with expressions that made clear this was more than business, more than convenience, more than 2 damaged people finding temporary comfort. This was real. This was lasting. This was what happened when you stopped running and started building. Marcus found Garrett by the Gulf Stream, the same aircraft that had carried him to Miami and Dubai and every destination in between, now polished for another training flight. Beautiful day for flying. Every day is a beautiful day for flying. Getting philosophical in your old age. Marcus's smile carried affection earned through 40 years of watching pilots come and go and recognizing the exceptional when he saw it. You earned it, son. We all did. Together. The afternoon flight was charter to New York, routine now. The kind of work that paid bills and built hours and felt nothing like the hiding that mopping floors had represented. Garrett went through the pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency, his hands moving through procedures that had become second nature again, muscle memory overriding the 8 years of intentional forgetting. Sterling Tower. This is Sterling 1, requesting clearance for departure. Sterling 1, you are cleared. Runway 2, 7, wind light, visibility unlimited. Garrett taxied to the runway, the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders like a mantle he'd learned to wear without flinching. The Gulf Stream responded to his inputs with mechanical precision, an aircraft that knew its pilot and trusted him to treat it with the respect physics demanded. "Ready for another one, Captain?" Jason Rodriguez's voice, but different now. No longer the panicked question of someone facing death, but the casual observation of someone along for the ride, present but not intrusive, remembered but not haunting. "Always ready, Lieutenant. Let's fly." Garrett pushed the throttle forward. The engines roared. The aircraft accelerated down the runway that had witnessed his transformation from invisible to inevitable, from janitor to captain, from man hiding from his past to man building his future. At rotation speed, he pulled back on the yoke. The wheels left the ground. Chicago fell away beneath him. The lake, the buildings, the neighborhoods where people lived lives measured in increments too small to see from altitude. Up here, everything simplified. Up here, the rules were clear. Up here, you rose or fell based on understanding physics and trusting yourself and having the courage to push past fear towards something that looked like freedom. And Garrett Sullivan rose into the sky, not running from anything, not chasing anything, just flying, free and whole, and finally, completely home. Because that's what brave people do. They fall, they break, they lose everything. And then they get back up. They fly again, and they never, ever stop.